Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as ever, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And joining us today, Wes Cheek. Wes has been with us before to talk about one of his areas of expertise. I'm sure he has many. The one I'm most familiar with is this disasters. Wes, reintroduce yourself for folks who haven't heard you the earlier times on Left Reckoning.
Yeah, hey guys. So my name's Wes Cheek. I'm originally from the Panhandle of Florida, so I've been interested in disasters for a while. But I've bounced around in the last few times that I've been on here. So I was working in Kyoto, Japan, at Ritsumeikan University, and then I was at Edge Hill University near Liverpool, UK, and now hopefully I've settled down. I'm at Massachusetts Maritime Academy here on lovely Cape Cod. I'm a New Englander now. I'm getting used to that lifestyle. So but I research disasters. I'm a sociologist of disasters. And I should say, too, part of that academic journey, I went to school at Tulane, so we get all the disasters down there as well. So,
Yeah, Florida, New Orleans connections,
Japan,
Japan. So yeah, a lot of the key points or key areas.
Right.
What are and you've told us a little bit before, but just remind folks some of your general lessons and sort of reframes when it comes to disasters.
Yeah, sure. And I like it. I like talking to your audience because I don't have to go through the whole spiel buildup. So I write about disasters from a leftist perspective. In particular, I'm a Marxist disaster person. And so, when you're doing Marx, you know that we socially produce our reality, right? We socially produce these things around us. And when we look at disasters, so often I was watching all the news coverage this week. It's just these things that happen. It's just, it's a natural disaster. It's a thing that happens to people. Hey, how can we predict this? Here it is. Or at best, it's a weather or a climate event, right? But a lot of us who write about disasters, even from a not Marxist, not leftist perspective, have understood for decades that no disaster is natural, meaning that things that happen where there aren't people, where there aren't societies, aren't considered disasters. They're just hazards. They're just weather events or earthquakes or other bad things that happen. But that if we really want to understand disasters, you have to understand everything that's wrapped up in this kind of package of society and how we produce society. So that's why so many of our disasters in America have really heavy racial dynamics, really heavy class dynamics, right? Really heavy gender dynamics, because we have a gendered, racist, classist society. And so you can't understand a disaster just by talking about the weather or the climate. And, I always say on social media, I feel kind of like a jerk. I don't want to be a jerk to meteorologists and climatologists because I think they do super important work that's critical to understanding all of this. They do great work. But you can't just understand a disaster as being something about climate or something about weather. It's about society, right? It's about socially produced elements of our society. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's it was Hurricane Helene that recently impacted a lot of Appalachia.
Mm-hmm.
And, the way these things are talked about, we don't talk about the absence of, say, Tennessee Valley Authority flood mitigation in certain areas and in others. And is that sort of what you're talking about?
All of that stuff. My favorite book on disasters ever is by Kai Erickson. It's called Everything in Its Path. It was written about it's a 1972 Buffalo Creek flood in West Virginia. And he extensively writes about how this disaster, it could only happen that way in Appalachia, right? That's the region. This region has a really complicated history. It has a really rich and deep history, but you have to understand that history before you just start talking about a flood, right? And so I think that goes into this as well. I've worked most summers of my life in Asheville or near Asheville up in the mountains in North Carolina. And that's a really particular area. It's a unique area with its own very particular history, right? The border of Tennessee and North Carolina. And so you can't just say, hey, places flood, mountains flood, right? You have to look at that's a colonized, heavily extraction economy, which has turned into a tech economy, which has turned into a rapidly gentrifying area of the country. And all of that's wrapped up in this.
Over your time looking at this stuff, how would you say the sort of late or dumbing down awareness of climate change is now factoring into this sort of thing? Because there's a way I like the Upper Midwest gets talked about as this great destination
Right.
for folks who are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm starting to look at that stuff as like, is that for human beings who want to make sure they're in their families don't get flooded away, or is that mainly for investors who want to invest in properties
Sure.
that people are going to have to move to later? But it seems to be like some weird awareness. And now with, I mean, $50 billion of damages in Florida, I'm seeing from Hurricane Milton. The awareness that the material impacts of climate change, it does seem to be leaking in a little bit, even though like the actually doing anything about it, that seems to be like in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, it's strange because I think like probably like a lot of people, like I've always wondered when it becomes completely unavoidable to address climate change, when we are forced to say, yes, it's here, we're in the climate crisis. Like, what does that look like for people who have said that doesn't exist, or for who are confronting and having to actually finally deal with it? What does it look like? And I don't really know yet, but we're kind of seeing how that's going to shape up, and it's kind of weird, right? Like you led in with like, what will we be safe in the Midwest? And I've always heard things like, Chicago is really well positioned for climate change. We have a freshwater lake, but then also Chicago has one of the worst heat waves in recorded American history in 1995 that killed hundreds of, we're not sure how many people it killed, right? So it really, like you said, is it investors? Is it people? Like if you're a poor person in Chicago, it's probably not well positioned for climate change. If you're a rich person in Florida, like Tiger Woods flew his jet out the day of the hurricane, you're probably well positioned in Florida, right? You can walk away from all of it. So, like I was saying before, like where you're positioned has a lot more to do with your class position in America than it does your geographic location.
Yeah, I mean, I was curious if we could sort of look at these two recent storms and then get a stronger sense of like the role here, because I think that this is an important point, is to sort of recognize that there's like way cities are built, there's way things are sort of designed, there's resources before and after a storm, they're sort of distributed in different ways. But I mean, how can we look at these kind of recent examples in the Carolinas and in Florida, with this lens?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been thinking about that as I watch them, right? And like one thing I noticed in the coverage of Florida, the lens, I was kind of noticing like what lens is absent, right? And so they would talk about like, well, if Tampa Bay gets a 12-foot storm surge, a lot of people live around Tampa Bay, and that's really dangerous. That's true, but they never went into why do a lot of people live around Tampa Bay? Why do we let a lot of people live around Tampa Bay? Why in America, we had this huge influx of people moving to Florida during COVID, right? Because it in a lot of ways is a nice place to live. A lot of them were doing, conservative cosplay, and Ron DeSantis is the governor, and they can come to Florida. But people move for a lot of different reasons, right? Why aren't we using the lens of development? Why aren't we using the lens of who has mobility? Why aren't we looking at how we build these places, right? And especially under the DeSantis administration, a lot of ways that have been, climate change cannot be addressed in our state documents in Florida anymore. So what are the ways that we're building in these ways? And Asheville is similar. Like I love Asheville, but Asheville has a lot of people who moved there from the tech industry that could do work from home, and it was an inexpensive place to live. And I don't know if you've been to Asheville in a while, but it is not an inexpensive place to live anymore. You cannot afford to live in Asheville as a working class person anymore. So why aren't we using like a gentrification lens to look at this? And I don't want to segue too much for you, but I think like part of these conspiracy theories that are coming out, like is gentrification play a role in that? Where in Asheville, there's a definite class conflict between people who are from the mountains and people who've moved in because you can get a 3-bedroom house there for way cheaper than you can in, San Francisco. So I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at, but it seems to me like there's an absence of lenses in our coverage of these things.
I think so, because I think when it comes to climate change, from both like on the denialist level, there's only so many words we can say about that. Right. But even from the kind of like liberal to left spectrum, yeah. It has sort of transferred over into almost like, frankly, into like a kind of spiritual conversation, right? It's like climate change is going to come and punish us for our ignorance, our political failures. If you're a socialist or something, maybe for our consumerism, et cetera, et cetera.
Or it's going to punish us for where we're from in the country and what we think that politically the meaning is. Like, you get all the time, like, well, these Southerners are having disasters, don't they kind of have it coming, right? Look who they vote for, right? Looking at the most kind of gerrymandered, oppressed regions of the country and saying, they kind of deserve it, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's really frightening because I think on one, and who knows who can tell the future, but on one hand, there's a version of America, particularly the American South, where there's very little mitigation done, right? Or there is one where there's kind of like elite mitigation, right? Like something that I think would probably be a good thing is something like the Ike Dike to protect Houston from storm surge, right? Because Houston is a city, part of the state now that's getting really battered with this kind of thing. And I'm not saying that this is the case, but just as something to think about, it's like, there are kind of questions about how those things get built, who gets included, who gets not included in those kind of protection, what communities are like, okay, we got to protect this neighborhood versus that neighborhood. I mean, New Orleans is probably, one of the most famous, infamous examples of how like class really, really exposed itself when it comes to a major storm.
Absolutely. And like, we've been talking about that in my classes all week. And, we took the students to New Orleans earlier this year, and we were looking at the new flood protection system, like the $9 billion or however much it is flood protection system there, right? And there are still communities that are outside of that flood protection system, right? There were decisions that were made about who gets to be inside it and who gets to be outside it, right? And so there are places across America that were kind of saying, maybe we're not going to invest in mitigation over here. Maybe it doesn't get built. And Southeast Louisiana is a weird example because it is a really poor, in some ways, area, but it also gets a huge amounts of infrastructure investment, but then you have to look at, well, what is this protecting? Like a lot of it protects Port Fourchon, which is where our oil and gas come into the country from. And, after Hurricane Ida, what's up and running like a day later is Port Fourchon because it has to be up and running or else, our economy grinds to a halt. So,
You're back on Twitter now, Wes. Why is that?
Just briefly.
Okay. What brought you back?
So my colleague, who people might know from Twitter as well, Sam Montano, who does the Lord's work on Twitter, trying to beat back all of these rumors and stuff. Friday night, she messaged me and she's like, "You have to come back over here and at least look at this." And so I was like, "No, I don't think I can. I made the break. I finally got clear. I can't." But then I went back over and it was like, oh my God, people actually believe this stuff. There's like people out here significantly believe that all of these stories. And so I'm trying to pitch in just a little bit and be a bit of a rodeo clown while Sam does the serious work. And I am like, well, how does anyone believe this stuff? But I've been over there, since Friday, and it's astonishing. It's astonishing what goes around. And I'm catching way less of it than other people who are engaged in the fight. But there's a lot of strange stuff going on.
So I've seen a few things on TikTok. One, it's good that AI, and maybe I'll put this on, but I was holding this up. AI shows us some maybe ways that we can get around in a hurricane is just to put a raft around your luxury vehicle
Sure, why
and
not?
drive.
I mean, it's good that we use all the power from AI that's probably fueling global warming to make that image. Really happy about it.
You have to imagine these solutions before you can implement them. And then is another person, and this one's maybe not worth showing, but it's like it's showing the path they're expecting Milton to take, and then the areas that went Trump versus Biden. And now this is so like these areas.
I saw this one, but it's not a very good map, and doesn't exactly show what they wanted to show, right?
Well, because it's a classic thing where you think land equals people, because like it's hitting Tampa and Orlando directly, and those are two major Dem voting areas.
Well, so I was going over this in my class last week with these rumors. It's like, okay, so there's a weather, we can move the weather, and we decide to target Buncombe County, North Carolina, which is one of the most reliably Democrat voting districts in North Carolina. Like, I don't know if you've been to Asheville, but it's like, the hippiest city that you can get to now that Austin has fallen. Sorry, David. Now that Austin has fallen, like Asheville is that, right? Like what? So if you had the ability to target politically, like you're missing, like what are you doing? Like target the panhandle. Come on.
Right. And I mean, this is maybe outside your portfolio, Wes, but what's the reality of cloud seeding at this moment? Like, it's a marginal, I would think, right?
Yeah, my
like
students. So my students are helping me out with this because, like, I've been pushing them really hard on this is made up, and then they'll come up with things like, well, in Dubai, like, they see clouds. But I think it's just a scale thing, right? Like, you can seed a cloud a little bit, and maybe it will work, right? Like they did, I think, for the Olympics in China to try to get the weather clear for the marathon, right? But like a hurricane is scales beyond this. You could not, like, as we know, the science shows you could drop a nuclear bomb in it. It's not going to do anything. Like, it's massive. You couldn't influence if you wanted to.
Right. Yeah. That's and I always didn't even know if Dubai was and China were like,
I don't know,
frankly, right about the capabilities. Like, I don't know. I'd have to see that stuff.
One of my students told me he watched a TikTok about two guys in China who got an anti-aircraft gun and are trying to seed clouds to water their farm with it. Like, I don't know about that. Like, maybe, like, best of luck to them. It's kind of cool they got an anti-aircraft gun, but like,
it'd be fun to try.
Yeah, I would try it. I'm all for it. To fire an anti-aircraft gun into a cloud, but I don't know if it's going to do.
I don't know what that says about the world where instead of doing rain dances, we're now just trying to shoot rain out of the sky.
Shoot the cloud. Why not?
Well, do you think this was worse, this media environment, than, like, say, Katrina?
It's the worst. It's the worst. I can't believe it. It's the worst. And I've been trying to, like, it's good to be kind of teaching 19-year-olds right now, because they have access to media that I don't even come into contact with, right? Like, they're getting, like, TikTok reels, like, on a daily basis, just plugged into their brain. And I don't want to be like an old Grandpa Wes and say, like, they're getting that TikTok. Like, I think there's probably really valuable work going on TikTok as well. But, like, just there's no filter for them. And this is the worst I've ever seen. It's like Katrina was a different way. Katrina, an issue you had was still kind of an older model of media where it's like the big stations, right? And it's like they're giving a narrative, they're raping babies in the Superdome narrative, which is, like, not true. Heavily racist narrative. New Orleans is a war zone, which we know was not true. Like, crime went down during Hurricane Katrina. Like, so you had that. But, like, right now what you're getting is just everything from everywhere. Like, this might be possible. This might be possible. They might be controlling the weather. I've never seen a plane fly in this pattern, so that must mean the government controls it. But even worse, you're getting stuff that was making me nuts the other day. I was looking at, like, the comments on all these, which is like, oh, FEMA don't know what they're doing, like, in the mountains, right? Like, people who work from FEMA are from New York City and San Francisco. They don't know what they're getting into when they get into Appalachia. And it's like, I work there every year of my life. I feel like I know what goes on there, but not like people who work for FEMA are, like, from, like, Harvard and stuff. Like, I don't, like, what is this? And, like, the thing is, like, I feel like that's people from the outside who, like, really want this to be true. Like, if you spend time in Appalachia, it's like more diverse than you think. It's different than you think. It's not, but for a lot of America, it represents kind of white working class image, right? Like the real true, America's true white people, right? The way to put it, right? And so, like, I think that there's a lot of commentators out there, a lot of people watching this stuff who kind of want for these rumors to be true so they can have kind of like white Katrina, you know what I mean? And the thing about really understanding America is, like, you can't really get that, right? Because that wouldn't, you could do Katrina because it was too not white people, right? And Hurricane Maria, just to put it as straight as possible, right? So, like, I have all the sympathy in the world for people going through what they're going through in North Carolina right now, but they're not going through what happened in Katrina, which was a, like, whole scale failure of the federal government, right?
Mm.
Yeah, there's an opportunist sort of both, I guess, libertarian or even crypto white supremacist narrative about that stuff that does focus entirely on the government conspiracy of either neglect or malice that would include, like, creating a tornado and throwing it at one of the major states. That just seems like, it just seems so obvious that, like, this should be a moment where we're reckoning with the sort of externalities of industrial capitalism and how we've pretty much failed to mitigate, but we are all owed loss and damage for that. We talked with our boys at La Ruta da Clima about loss and damage as like the new sort of emphasis from countries saying, hey, look, help us with mitigation and infrastructure. But that beach is gone,
right?
Right. There's beaches gone in Florida now.
Yeah.
And that's what's so frustrating about this misinformation now is this should be a moment of reckoning.
Well, and the other thing, like, and I'm glad, again, like your audience, I think gets this stuff. Like, so I have to say to like my classes, like, actually FEMA is doing a good job. FEMA is working in this case. And I think they are to the extent that FEMA works, right? But then the other side of that is that like FEMA exists as like, a bourgeois organization to try to like patch over all of these externalities of capitalism, right? And to patch over the externalities of capitalism is impossible because capitalism is in a constant state of failing us. And so like as it fails us, you can't really just keep covering this over, you know what I mean? And so like I think people see those breaches, like literal and metaphorical, and are like, oh, why why is FEMA messing up? And it's like, there's really no great solution for maintaining our economic system and also mitigating disasters because these things are just they're in collision with each other. They don't work together. It's just not a thing you can do.
Yeah, there's so many case studies just from the length of this show. I mean, David with the Texas power outage. And now 2.5 million people without power in Florida as of this morning. It is just, look at the type of investment we're making. And you have Eric Schmidt just earlier this week saying, yeah, we're probably not going to hit those carbon goals.
Right.
But what we can do is give AI a bunch of power and hope that sorts it out. Like that is the class of people that has drove us over a cliff.
Yeah, they have. And like, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating because like we have decades and decades and decades of disaster research by like really, really smart people all over the spectrum doing really great, hard work. And then, I think this is the frustrating thing about every field in society right now, not just disasters. And then you get like an AI person who's like, we'll just have our computer look into it. And I think this will solve it. It's like, I don't think that it is. I don't hold out hope for that at all,
One other thing that occurs to ask, every once in a while, Americans that are sort of, feel the decaying infrastructure will post pictures of the Tokyo mega canals underneath the city and be like, your experience in Japan, like, are they ahead of us or do they have their own issues generally? Like, how would you characterize it?
I have a spiel on this. I'm happy to give it to you. So I used to do the international training for disaster professionals in Japan, right? And people come over and they're really impressed. But what a lot of people from the global south will kind of whisper to you at some point is like, we don't have the money to do this stuff, right? So Japan is good at disaster management. They are good at it, but they're good in kind of the sector of being one of the top 5 economies in the world for the past 50 years, right? So they're also able to do this because Japan doesn't, strictly speaking, have a military, right? In the Constitution, they can't have a military. They have the self-defense forces, but the self-defense forces can also be doing a lot of disaster work stuff because they're essentially a big national guard. So Japan was...
I think, sorry to cut you off, but I think every constitution, I think that seems like a good thing. A good way to put the military. Like you can do some self-defense stuff, but when that's not needed, go get people's homes unflooded.
Yeah, and I'll jump back to Japan in a second, but I caught you on Majority Report the other day, and you were saying something that I've thought for a long time, which is I remember being in the 1990s at the Crimson Cafe in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and saying, I'm thinking about joining the Marine Corps. And my friends were like, why would you do that? And I said, I think that at some point we're going to have a national service department where people go and work on disasters. And I think that I want to be a part of that, right? And so I think the point you were making would absolutely, if we had where you could sign up, young people could sign up, hey, what I want to do with the next 10 years of my life is just be of service working on disasters. Man, people would flock to that. Like, I don't want to go overseas. I don't want to murder people, but I would love to like work on disasters, right? I think you would have an energized youth out there who would be thrilled to do that kind of work. But
it would be like Starship Troopers. Yeah, honestly, people would be so enthusiastic.
One of the big problems, and this is one of my frustrations with U.S. emergency management, is that those pathways are not there. The way to get into emergency management in the U.S. is by being a cop, right? Or being like ex-military. The only other kind of the best circuit you can hope to do is be a firefighter, right? That's pretty much it, because emergency managers in the U.S., we're trying to train a new crop of them here who are emergency managers first, but emergency managers across the U.S. are like cops who get tasked with it as their like part-time job or as their kind of retirement position, or like people who retire from the military and like, hey, you want to do emergency management? So there's no like avenue to say like, I'm really interested in what happens to vulnerable populations during disasters, and I want to help with that, right? That's a whole different topic. Japan, really quickly, my quick spiel is that, yeah, Japan is good at this stuff, but Japan kind of had this space to be good at this because they had tons of money flowing out of everywhere for decades that they could just throw at everything, right? And they had kind of the space to make that happen. The problem is Japan doesn't have the bubble years economy anymore. The way they always kept the economy running was to just do massive infrastructure projects, right? They still do, right? The largest lobbies in Japan are the concrete lobby and the construction lobby, right? So if you have tsunamis, build a seawall. If you have flooding, build like concrete the rivers. If you have landslides, concrete the mountainside, right? So the solutions that Japan have seem impressive, but they're really hard infrastructure solutions. They are not as great at the soft solutions, like places like countries like Cuba or even Brazil, lots of countries in Latin America who do not have the money to invest in infrastructure, have to do these, what we call soft measures, are a lot better at it. That was my long way of getting back to my Japan answer.
That's fascinating.
Just like in conclusion, I want to ask you a kind of question. Like we were talking about, how these disasters sort of affect people, and recognizing that there's a separation between just like the actual like physical natural aspect of it and then like the human created aspect of it. And obviously like the solution here is to like have a very different system. But let's just imagine for a second that Bernie Sanders becomes president. He picks up the phone and he says, I need to speak, to the man, Wes, and ask him, what can I do in like these first couple of years as president, a transitionary state, to make us better? And maybe just to highlight a little bit on the disaster thing, obviously we're doing Green New Deal, all that kind of stuff, in addition.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm on the spot now. Well, first I would say you should implement the MATLEC National Service Disaster Service Program. Just start signing people up. I'm all for it. There is something called FEMA Corps, by the way. It's at a very smaller scale, but you can do this kind of stuff at a limited scale. But as my colleague Sam Montana points out, we don't have the capacity to do effective emergency management. There is not enough investment in emergency management. We need to professionalize the profession as it exists now. We need to start making it not about law enforcement, right? We need to start moving away from that. We need to immediately, the first thing, FEMA out of Homeland Security, FEMA out of DHS as soon as possible. I would say, Bernie, do that first day. Like FEMA needs to be but what it was under Clinton when it was functional, and be a cabinet level position that reports to the president, right? Because there's too many conflicting interests when you're in Homeland Security who are tasked with border, ICE, all of this stuff, right? So if your goal is to protect vulnerable people, you cannot be the people like trying to run vulnerable people into the ground, right? Like it just doesn't work. So yeah, first thing, so the MATLEC Public Service Program, the get FEMA out of DHS, and then just start pushing for building up capacity to be able to address the larger disasters that are coming, because this doesn't get any better for the rest of our lifetimes, or our children's lifetime, right? So start thinking ahead that we need to invest in this, and we need to professionalize emergency managers and not just make it a part-time job for retired cops. And I say that with great sympathy for those people who are emergency managers right now who come from that background. It's not their fault that that's kind of the avenue, right? A lot of them work really hard and care a lot about this stuff. It's just that's what we have on offer as a part-time job for retired people to be emergency managers. So those would be my big 3 or 4 there.
Wes Cheek at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. Wes, thanks so much for joining us. At Wes in Japan, at Wes in Japan on Instagram and for a limited time on Twitter.
But I'm on Blue Sky. I'm a very happy guy on Blue Sky, just being nice to people, not being a jerk over there, just like chatting it up, not doing the Twitter battles anymore. But I'm on Twitter for limited time only. Get it while you can.
There you go. Thanks, Wes.
Yeah, good to see you guys.